All right, it's time to begin. Let's, if you're unfamiliar with where we are, we'll be continuing Colossians chapter 3 here in just a minute. But before we do that, let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for this opportunity that we have where we can come together and study your word. And please help us to concentrate on it, do away with any exterior thoughts, and come away with the lessons that you have prepared, and there are many, and please help us to implement them in our lives, and we may be more like Jesus in that way. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so as I said, we are in Colossians 3, and just as sort of a reminder of where we've been overall, we've talked about Jesus' superiority. That is one of the themes in Colossians. Remember, there's this opposing group, this opposing teaching, which asserted in some sense that Jesus wasn't superior, and therefore Paul has to remind them. But in his reminding the Colossians of that, there's also some very practical concerns. And that's what we're looking at tonight, really, and what we'll continue to look at. Not this coming Sunday, but the Sunday after that, which will actually be the last class. That's where we'll finish everything up, of course. So we'll see these practical teachings tonight, and then we'll see them on Sunday as well. All right, but before we get to those, I wanted to remind you of these two if clauses. He has one at the end of chapter 2. He has another one at the beginning of chapter 3. This one, remember, he says, if you have died with Christ. And as I said before, rhetorically, I think he wants them to think, well, of course we've died with Christ. And so then he says that these are matters which have to be sure the appearance of wisdom and self-made religion and self-abasement, severe treatment, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. And that, I think, is the jumping off point for the next argument that he makes. All right, so if you've died with Christ, then the things that these false teachers are telling you won't have any, they won't provide you with any help against fleshly indulgence. All right, so then he says, if then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things above. All right, so he says what they're teaching is not going to help you. What will help you? Seeking the things that are above. That's the solution, right? So it's I think it's a very intricate argument, but it's easy to follow, right? Seek the things that are above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth, for you have died, right? Notice how that corresponds with what we just read. If you have died, Paul says, no, you have. I'm aware that you have. So he's letting them know you have died, therefore you need to be aware of of what it means to set your mind on things above. Then he says, your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. And this is, I think, where we left off last time. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. All right, so what does it mean to set your mind on things above? Well, he's going to tell us specifically what that is in positive terms in just a little bit. But for right now, he says, it's not that. It's not these things. Okay, when you practice these things, you're not having your mind set on things above. That's essentially what he means. And again, we went through all those, so we don't have to do that again. But now we get to the part that we didn't talk about. In these you too once walked when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away. Okay, so maybe those practices were characteristic of your previous life. They shouldn't be anymore. So he says, put them all away. Okay, now, remember the stuff he mentioned? Greed, sexual immorality. When we look at those sins, we say, yeah, those are the really big ones, right? You don't need to have those. I think we would be all in agreement with that. But now he gets to some stuff which I think we are probably much more susceptible to fall into. So he says, you must put them all away. The all here is interesting because if you didn't have the rest of this, you would assume he's talking about what came before, but he's not. Notice the translation puts a colon here. So you must put them all away. What's the them? It's what comes afterward. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. And we'll just go that far right now. Okay, anger. And we know of examples in Scripture where someone is angry for a justifiable reason. We sometimes say righteous indignation. And we know he's not talking about that. But I think sometimes we can tend to justify ourselves with anger by saying, well, it was righteous indignation. What is a righteous way to be angry? Because we've all been angry. Some of it struggle with it more than others. And I'll admit, I probably struggle with it more than many people in here. I'll admit that. Okay, but what does it mean when we try to say, well, I was angry, but it was righteous indignation? What does that mean, properly speaking? All right, maybe that's too difficult of a question.
Being angry without sinning.
What?
Being angry without
Okay, that's one way to look at it, right? Yeah.
If God is our standard for righteousness, then the things that God would have cause to be angry about, the things that God would have cause to be happy about, it should be in accordance with that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I think both really go along well together. You can be angry, do not sin. We know that passage from Ephesians. But it's also being angry in line with the things that angers God, right? That's absolutely correct. Yeah, what were you going to say?
That's what we'll say, like when Jesus
Yep.
overturned the tables. He
Yep.
wasn't doing that because somebody insulted him.
Right.
He was doing it because it was an affront on his father.
Yep, okay. That's a classic example. I'm glad you mentioned that. Because that shows what it looks like to have anger in a righteous fashion because it is offensive to God, not because it's offensive. Like you said, they didn't insult Jesus, directly, I guess you could say, right? Because they didn't believe, when they insulted Jesus, they didn't believe they were insulting God, right? So we can kind of get away from that problem maybe from a certain perspective. Yeah, what were you going to say?
If you look at these, the previous one, right, from an anger, even if we walked into a room and we saw some of our brothers and sisters engaging in some sort of acts or slandering or obscene talk, I would think that if you're looking at your life and you come into that situation, you would be upset, you would be angry, and you would have an issue with what was going on.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One example I thought about is when Nathan spoke with David, and David was angry about the story that Nathan told him. It was righteous indignation. That was unjust
Yeah, good point.
and not fair. And then you realize it was himself and Nathan said, "You've given enemies of the Lord cause to blaspheme." So there was anger in that.
Yeah. That's a good example. I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
I was going to also conclude it was a reaction, and it's kind of a reaction to an injustice in the sense that the righteous indignation. So it's, in Jesus' sense, he reacted
Yep.
to the injustice. In the same sense with David, he reacted to the injustice.
Yep. And the injustice, back to Jared's point, should be in accordance with God's will, right? But that's a little bit tricky. Okay, because sometimes we can justify our anger when it's really not God's will, it's our will. Okay, so for example, not that this would ever happen, but if someone, was going really slowly on the way to church in front of me and they were holding me up, they were keeping me from coming to services, and I get angry about that. That's righteous indignation, right? That's justified. Thank you. Hope my wife heard that. That's one way we sort of try to manipulate it a little bit to justify ourselves. That's why we have to be very careful. That's my point. We have to be very careful that when we get angry, it's not because of something that's done to us. Why do people get angry generally? Let's just get to the very basic issue. I'm not a psychologist, but I can observe, and from my own observance, from your observances, why do people get angry? Yeah.
Well, I think you've got to define distinguishing between being upset.
Okay.
Turning your upset into anger, because anger is an aggressive action.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it certainly
We should be
can be.
upset at sin.
I'm sorry, what?
We should be upset when we sin.
Okay.
When someone sins.
Yep. Yeah, there is a difference between being upset and being angry. Steve.
I think in the word here, I noticed the same word is translated in Galatians 5 by some translations as outbursts of anger or fits of anger.
Okay.
As if what he's saying here has to do with an improper, passionate response
Yeah.
to a person that would be not fitting. That anger produces something that it should not.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good observation in this context, especially, hopefully that'll make sense, because these words translated slander and obscene talk, as we'll see in a minute, they also have the connotation of saying something in an inappropriate context, or saying it in a way that's inappropriate for the context. That's a better way to put it. So yeah, I think that's the way to look at it. Your level of anger is more than being upset. It goes beyond that and goes beyond the specific situation. I think the reason that we get angry a lot of times is because we feel disrespected, right? We feel like somebody has disrespected us in some way, and that's what makes us angry. Not all the time, but I think a lot of time that's what it is. Okay. Now again, we talk about traffic. That's more annoyance. That's maybe more being upset. It's kind of hard to be angry because, I figured this out not too long ago. It takes me a while sometimes, but when people cut you off in traffic, it's not a personal affront. They don't know you. Okay, I only figured this out a couple of years ago. So, like I said, it takes me a while. But it's not you can't take it personally. They're just bad drivers. They're all over the place down here, right? And by the way, you may think, man, he's got a real problem in traffic, but you can ask Joni. It's not really true. So I think that's why anger is such a problem, because we feel disrespected. But again, there's an element of selfishness there, isn't it? When we have righteous indignation, it's not about me. It's about God, as you guys have said. So I think that's an important difference. Anger, as we've already seen, is not something that's sinful necessarily, but it can become so pretty quickly, I think. All right, so wrath, which is, maybe we should think about this being, sorry, John.
Any of us that have raised children or in the process of raising children, you know children can provoke you.
A little bit, yep. Yeah, little, occasionally.
They get angry. But what's important is not to lose self-control.
Yeah,
Because then you're going to do damage.
yep.
to traffic.
And sometimes that damage can last years, and it can impact your relationship for years sometimes. And raising children, I mean, that's, oh boy, yeah, absolutely, that they can provoke anger. But again, I think it's worth asking, why is my child making me so angry? Is it because they are acting in a way that is not befitting of a good, responsible person? And if they don't correct this behavior, they can have big problems later on? Or is it because they're not doing what I told them to do? I told them to do this, and they're not doing it. How dare they disrespect what I said? Now, again, that rings true to my experience, not just me, if I'm being honest, but also observing others. So yeah, I think that's a good point. We could have an entire discussion about anger when raising children, but maybe we shouldn't. All right, so we have wrath, we have malice, which sometimes this can be translated as evil. And all right, I've got slander emboldened here, and we're going to look at slander and obscene talk in some detail. We've got another class after this, as I said, so we've got a little bit of time to do something like this. This is a little bit different than what we've done before, but I think it's worth talking about these words that often don't occur very often in the New Testament, and yet they say something about speech, about communication. Why is that so important? Well, think about what Jesus said. I think it's one of the scariest verses in the New Testament, and that's when Jesus said, "For every careless word, you'll have to give an account." Every careless word. Now, if I ask for a show of hands of everybody who said a careless word, I mean, would anybody keep their hand down? I mean, I doubt it. No offense, but I doubt it. And I think this is even more pertinent now since we communicate in so many other ways other than face-to-face communication. If you think about in antiquity, when this was written in the first century, what are the ways they could communicate? Well, they could communicate face-to-face. They could communicate by writing a letter like we have in Colossians. They could communicate on inscriptions. Rulers could communicate by imprinting coins, and maybe a few other exceptions. That's about it. So now we have all that stuff, and then it's multiplied with texting, phone calls, emails, and don't get me started on social media, right? Does it matter what we say in those arenas? Is that the same thing that we're talking about here? In other words, I get the impression that some people think how we communicate face-to-face is different. There are different rules for how we communicate face-to-face versus how we communicate via text, email, social media. And if that's how somebody thinks, please show me the distinction in Scripture. Please show me the distinction in logic. Okay, I'm happy to see it because I don't see it. I think the rules that we see in Scripture about primarily face-to-face speaking ought to be applied in those other avenues. Again, I'm willing to be convinced if somebody can say otherwise. All right, so what is this? So therefore, that mini introduction out of the way, therefore, I think it's important we look at these words. What does it mean to slander? This one's a little bit easier than the next one. The word here, okay, so this is going to take a little bit of explanation. This is from, and this is at the very bottom, Bauer, Denker, Art, and Gingrich, the third edition, published in 2000. This is the Greek lexicon of New Testament studies. If you're serious about studying New Testament Greek, that's the lexicon, period. Okay? Unfortunately, it's only accessible if you know Greek. In other words, the words are in Greek. It's not in English, right? So if you don't know Greek, you can't really look the words up. So, sorry. But this is the standard lexicon. So in other words, if we were reading the Greek New Testament and we wanted to look words up, that's one of the first steps, right? To learning a language, looking words up in a lexicon or a dictionary, this is where we would go. It's the first step. All right, so what does this word mean? Well, look at the transliteration, blasphemia. Blasphemy. That's where we get the word, right? Well, blasphemy, and I don't have this up here, but blasphemy, of course, is disrespectful speech against a deity. It's used in the New Testament that way, of course. It's also used in non-biblical Greek texts. But that's not what it means here in Colossians 3. So, this is straight from it. I haven't added anything. This is from the lexicon itself. So, what does this word mean that's translated slander? Speech that denigrates. Slander. All right, it's just a very quick lesson on what we can't do. And this is, you hear people do this a lot. But we can't take any of those definitions that we like and plug it in here. I really like the word denigration. Makes me sound smarter. I'm going to plug it in the translate. That's not how this works. These are potential glosses for the word. This is what we might refer to as the semantic range Okay, so when you're translating one word or from one language to another, there is a semantic range. It can only mean things within this range. So within that range, that's what we've got here. Reviling, denigration, disrespect, slander. And then the first definition he has under here is generally of any kind of speech that is defamatory or abusive, Colossians 3:8. Any kind of speech that is defamatory. So this was updated by Denker. This lexicon's been around a long time, but he updated it significantly in 2000. And so this is probably his comment about Colossians 3:8. That's what it means according to him in Colossians 3:8. But by the way, and be very clear, they could be mistaken. But this is one of those situations where if you're going to contend with BDAG, you're going to argue with one of their definitions, well, you need to do the research. And Denker studied Greek New Testament for 70 years, I think. I mean, he's like 90 when he died, which was a few years ago. Okay, so if we're going to disagree with these people, which we can, we better have some good evidence. So anyway, that's just an aside. So he says, generally of any kind of speech that's defamatory or abusive. Abusive speech. I think that's a good way to think about it. That's pretty general, but that includes a lot of things. And again, we talk about social media. That's where people go to use abusive speech a lot of times. I don't think it should be that way. And I think it really, let me be very transparent here. I don't have social media, so that already tells you my presupposition about it. I don't think it's very valuable. I don't think it's very useful. You may disagree. That's fine. Okay? But I just want you to know that's where I'm coming from. And maybe you have a different philosophy about it. That's okay. Seriously, that is okay. But for me, when it's so easy to use that kind of speech, I don't want any part of it. I don't want any part of it. So I think we ought to think about this because, frankly, would most of us use slander towards somebody else in person? Would we be more likely to do that in person? Or would we be more likely to do that in social media or in text? Maybe it's not social media. Maybe that's not how we do that. But we may text somebody else abusive or defamatory speech against somebody else, right? This gets pretty close, I think, to gossip. And by the way, why do you use speech that is abusive? Why does somebody do that? Why would somebody use abusive speech? Because you're angry. Who said that? Yeah, you're angry. Is this symptomatic of righteous indignation? Abusive speech? Maybe it could be, but you got to be very careful. Yeah. To anger other people? It can be. Is that healthy? Often not. Okay? And again, we have to be careful. This is why I think, again, I'll use social media as an example, but we could apply it in other venues of communication, and that is we need to think carefully before we say anything or before we post anything. Why am I doing this? And there can be all kinds of reasons for it. Maybe I'm posting something that truly ought to be said. Maybe I'm posting something because I want to feel better about myself. I want to look better in front of other people. Now, again, that's not really what he's saying here, but if we're abusing somebody else by speech, is that okay to post that? And by the way, is this just about other Christians? In other words, we shouldn't use speech that is abusive toward other Christians, but other people it's okay. Is that acceptable? No, that's not acceptable. Think about, oh boy, I'm very hesitant to bring this up, but the past presidential debate. Was there any abusive speech on social media about both candidates from Christians? And again, I don't know for sure. I'm not on there. But I hear things. And so I think that's true. Should we be doing that? And again, you may think we should. You may think it's appropriate. But just ask the question. That's all I want us to do because I think this is very serious. Yeah.
When you talk about thinking about
Yep.
Do everything in the name of Jesus.
Yep.
I mean, can you admonish someone that sins in the name of Jesus? Sure.
Yep.
Can you yell at that guy in traffic in the name of Jesus? Can you badmouth someone on social media in the name of Jesus?
The traffic for sure, but not social media. Yeah.
I mean, if we use
No, you're right.
use that as our compass,
Yep. Yep.
you know, we can really go back and say, okay, should I really have done that
Yep.
or said that in the name of Jesus?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. That is a very good, like you said, very good compass. Yeah.
I think the other part of communication in general is it takes both a sender and a receiver.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be careful how we say things, what we say, because it could be of the best intent. It's not received that way. That doesn't necessarily mean that it makes it wrong or right one way or the other. But I do think that just based on what the comment Mike just made, it's thinking about what you
Yep.
say before you open your mouth or your text or whatever it is,
Yep.
and say,
Yep.
how can this be received?
Yep.
May not be the way I intended it, but be careful.
Yeah, and that's, again, like you said, that's part of thinking about what you're saying. Who is the recipient or recipients? And that's where social media is so difficult, because you post something on Twitter, Instagram, whatever, Facebook, you don't have just a handful of friends, most people, right? You have close friends, but you have some people who probably don't know you that well. How are they going to take it, right? They're going to probably take it very differently than somebody who knows you very well. So I think that's also an excellent point. Yeah.
But there's also a sense in which God is very plain spoken about who his enemies are. The imprecatory Psalms. Jesus did not walk on eggshells around his enemies. He called his enemies his enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a sense in which we want to spare other people's feelings. But I mean, the Pharisees deserved the lambasting of God.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a lot of criticism levied at them because they deserved a lot of criticism. And I think that, and Jesus loved them while he was doing it.
Yep.
And I think that there is a sense in which harsh speech is warranted.
Okay. I think there are circumstances where that's true. Absolutely. The difference is, though, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees in very harsh ways, like you said, he knows their hearts. He knows their past actions. He knows their future actions. We don't have any of that information. So, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying we have to be careful. Therefore, we could justify any sort of harsh speech by saying, well, that's how Jesus talked, right? I've heard people say that, and they speak harshly to other people, and you're thinking, well, is that really an appropriate application? And I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I do think we ought to make that distinction. Yeah.
I think a great example of it would be when John calls the Pharisees who were vipers.
Yep.
Very defamatory, not necessarily abusive, but very, big, bold statement that very harshly defames them. It's a big, righteous way of John using that type of speech.
Yeah, and of course, when John does that, I mean, could you imagine being there? That would have been shocking, and I'm sure those people thought, hey, he's abusing us with his speech, right? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You can also tell someone they're wrong while also being respectful.
Yep. Yeah, boy, that is, I think, a lost art, right? That we can't show our disagreement with people without being abusive. But that's the sign of maturity, when we can approach people and we can disagree with them. We can tell them they're wrong, but do it in a respectful manner. So yeah, that's also a really good point. Yeah.
And just to piggyback, we've all talked about it. Intent is so critical as we look at these in context. And I know James chapter 3, he's talking primarily about the tongue and speech, but I think the practical application is there. He makes the vivid point, with your same mouth you will do blessings and cursings, and he says sternly, brethren, it should not be so.
Yeah.
And what he's talking about there, and I think it translates to what you said before, texting, social media, written, etc. We have to be cautious about that. That what is our intent behind the language we're using, whether we're correcting, righteous indignation, whatever it may be. But there's an intent, when our intent is to curse, and and I'm looking out for me, I can't control anger. James clearly states through inspiration, brother, it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah.
You're not being Christ-like, to use the point Jared made earlier. You're not being Christ-like.
Yeah. And let me say this, and then we'll get to the next word, because it's also important. But James, in that same chapter, it's amazing that he says it's difficult to control the tongue. No, wait a minute. That's not what he says, is it? It's impossible to 100% of the time control the tongue. That also is pretty daunting, because there we have a statement. This is impossible for you to do perfectly. If it's that difficult, how careful should we be? How much should we ask of ourselves? What is my motivation? What is my starting point? Why am I doing this? Yeah, absolutely. All right, so the second one, all right? Slander and obscene talk from your mouth. I think this is difficult. As I said, this is more difficult, I think, than slander, although slander elicited a lot of comments from different perspectives. And so that was maybe more interesting than I thought, honestly. This one, though, is more difficult. Okay, obscene talk from your mouth. What is he talking about when he says obscene talk? All right, so this one is longer. It's more involved. Same source at the bottom. You see, Bauer, Denker, Art, and Gingrich. And this is Ischrologia. So this is speech of a kind that's generally considered in poor taste, obscene speech, dirty talk. And then he has a reference to Aristotle. We'll look at that in a minute. But it contrasts the preference for obscenity in older drama with a more refined taste of later times, and argues that, and that means the plural, so obscene speech, you could say, or obscenity, can be expected from those of servile nature, but not from a cultured gentleman. And again, that'll make more sense because I want to look at that passage. Okay, so obscenity might properly be defined as storytelling involving such unseemly deeds as adultery or pederasty. So this would be, and I think in the Aristotle passage, you could make that application to Homer, but we won't have to go into all that. Obscene expressions would also be used to flavor derogatory remarks, hence the rendering scurrilous talk. And then he has a few references, or actually two references from Polybius. They aren't very helpful, as helpful as Aristotle, so we'll just look at Aristotle. But he said that scurrilous talk is pertinent to Colossians 3:8, especially since blasphemia immediately precedes, right? Defamation immediately precedes. Okay, so derogatory remarks. But here, so you might say, all right, what's the difference between blasphemy or slander and this word? Because they both seem to have some sort of derogatory intent. This is to use obscene expressions. Okay, so let's look at the passage in Aristotle. Now, why are we looking at Aristotle? Well, for one thing, he gives us the best definition from an ancient author which precedes the New Testament. The thing about this is, I talked about the lexicon earlier. How do they get those definitions? Right? Did they find an ancient source that says, okay, here's our definition of this word? You don't have sources like that, hardly at all. So Aristotle is important because he does sort of give us the definition. But he's doing so in a particular context. What is he doing here? This is the Nicomachean ethics. This is the standard work of Aristotle on ethics. And one of the things he does in that work is he tries to find middle ground. For Aristotle, the way for an educated person to act was to find the middle ground. You want to avoid the extremes, which, by the way, it's not bad advice in a lot of cases, right? Well, anyway, this is what he says in the context of this word. The joking of a nobleman is different than that of someone with a slave-like nature, like the educated and the uneducated. All right, so notice he separated people into groups, and in whatever group those people are in, they're going to joke differently. The difference can be perceived by comparing the old comedies with the new ones. The former got their last from Ischrologia. There's our word. So we would say obscenities. And the latter from innuendo. What's innuendo? Just so we're all on the same page. Anybody know? Yeah, you're implying something. You're not coming right out and saying it. Okay, so the old comedies, they would just come out and say stuff and make these jokes like that. The latter are more sophisticated. They use innuendo. You know what they're getting at, but they don't have to come out and say it. That's the difference. Okay, well, is that particularly helpful? Maybe not so much. It's a starting point, right? But let's go on. Let's look at one more thing in this connection. Ischros. Okay, so the word we just looked at, Ischrologia, is a compound word. Ischros and logia. But the main word in that term is ischros. And so this term can help us, I think. In various senses, from ugly, in an external sense to base, as in moral deformity. A term especially significant in honor-shame-oriented society, generally in reference to that which fails to meet expected moral and cultural standards, opposed to kalos, that's like the good, pertaining to being socially or morally unacceptable, shameful, base. So, there's a certain sense in which this word that Paul's using here has to do with cultural expectation. So what he's saying back in Colossians 3:8 is what the world finds, we might put it this way, what the world finds obscene, you don't talk like that. Now that's a little bit difficult, isn't it? Because even in my lifetime, and I would just say even in the last 20 years, the level, I guess, of obscene talk has expanded. Does that make sense? I mean, does everybody know what I'm saying about that? I mean, it seems like more and more things are acceptable forms of speaking than they were back then. And all you have to do is think about, something like bumper stickers or T-shirts or something. Things that you find on the back of cars or on people's shirts a few years ago, it's just been completely unacceptable. Okay? So there is a sense in which the surrounding culture sets the expectation, but it's also, I would say, our responsibility is to, of course, go beyond that. But we certainly, I think, what does this amount to? I think this amounts to not talking like everybody else with specifics to obscenity. There are certain kind of jokes that are now very common, very popular. We don't have any business using those kind of jokes. I think that's probably closer to what he's talking about here when we look at what Aristotle said. Now, of course, here's the problem. Aristotle lived 3 centuries before Paul. You think the word changed a little bit? Probably. Okay, it's not going to mean something completely different, but it probably did change. And we just simply don't know to what extent it changed. Any questions or comments about that? What does him saying, put away obscene talk from your mouth, why? Why is that important? Why is it so important how we use our speech? And again, we've mentioned James 3. I mentioned that passage, I think it's Matthew 11, where Jesus says, about careless words. Think about all the passages in Proverbs about speech. Why does God spend so much time talking about that? Anybody know? Yeah.
Reflection of who we are.
Okay.
Who we don't want to be.
Yep.
We don't say certain words because those words are not good words to say. And while others are saying them, we don't say it because we want to be different. I want to be different from the world and the things that they say.
Okay. And a lot of times, I think, and it's not just words, it's also, the way we tell stories, the way we tell jokes, right? And Aristotle was using it in the context of joke telling, right? So there are certain jokes, certain kinds of jokes we should avoid. Why? Because it distinguishes us from the world. And maybe we should have read more in that Aristotle passage, but he goes on to say that people that are uneducated, they try to tell a joke and they laugh at everything and they try to tell any kind of, scandalous joke they can to get people to laugh. The educated person, he doesn't do that. He doesn't use humor that way. It's not all about him necessarily, right? And there are limitations to what he will say. And I'm using he because that's what Aristotle would say, probably. So I think, yeah, I think you're on the right track for sure. It distinguishes us. Yeah.
Jesus said in Matthew 15, it's not what enters in the mouth that defiles the man, but what proceeds out of the mouth.
Yeah.
This is what defiles the man. I think that's what he's getting.
Yeah, I do too.
This is something that is a defile.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's so easy to say something that will never be able to be taken back.
Yep.
And not just that, you can have a brief interaction with someone that you're not even talking to, that's walking by you, and from the conversation that they hear or from the words that they hear spoken, they might assume
Yep.
that you're not a Christian, assume that you're not a godly person, just by a few words.
Yep, exactly. That's a good point. I think that's a good point to end on. All right, we'll finish this up a week from Sunday. Thank you.